Welcome to the channel, The Coin Merchant, where we uncover the hidden fortunes that might be sitting right in your pocket. And today, we're diving into a story so incredible that it sounds like pure fiction, but I promise you, every word is true. What if I told you that a simple dime, the kind you'd use to make a phone call or toss into a tip jar without a second thought, could actually be worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, more than a luxury mansion, more than a fleet of exotic cars combined? Most people spend this coin every day without realizing it could buy a mansion. And that's exactly what we're talking about today with the 1987 Roosevelt Dime, a coin so seemingly ordinary that you've probably held dozens of them in your hands over the years, never knowing that one specific version of this dime has stunned collectors, made headlines in the numismatic world, and is currently valued at an absolutely mind-blowing $30 million. Yes, you heard that right, $30 million for a dime that was minted just a few decades ago in Denver, Colorado. Now, before we go any further, I need you to stick with me until the very end of this video because after we explore this incredible 1987 Roosevelt dime, I'm going to reveal 3 more dimes that are worth even more than this one, including one that recently shattered all records and sold for a price that will absolutely blow your mind, but I'm not going to spoil that surprise just yet. You'll have to keep watching to find out which dime holds the crown as the most valuable Roosevelt dime ever discovered, and trust me, the story behind it is unlike anything you've ever heard before. So, let's talk about the 1987 Roosevelt dime and why this particular coin has become one of the most sought-after treasures in modern American numismatics. The year 1987 was a remarkable time in American history. Ronald Reagan was president, the stock market was experiencing both incredible highs and the dramatic crash of Black Monday, the world was watching the Cold War tensions, and meanwhile, at the Denver Mint, millions upon millions of Roosevelt dimes were being struck and sent into circulation across the United States. The Roosevelt dime, as you probably know, has been a staple of American currency since 1946, created to honor President Franklin Delano Roosevelt shortly after his death, and the design by John R. Cynic features Roosevelt's profile on the obverse and a torch flanked by an olive branch and an oak branch on the reverse, symbolizing liberty, peace, and strength. In 1987, the Denver Mint produced approximately 762,709,481 Roosevelt dimes, all bearing the distinctive D Mint mark that indicates they were struck in Denver, and under normal circumstances, these coins are worth exactly 10 cents, nothing more, nothing less. But here's where the story takes an absolutely fascinating turn, because somewhere in that massive production run of over 762 million coins, something went catastrophically wrong, or perhaps incredibly right, depending on how you look at it. You see, the U.S. Mint operates with incredibly strict quality control standards. Every die used to strike coins is carefully inspected, every planchet, which is the blank metal disc that becomes a coin, is checked for proper weight and composition, and every finished coin is supposed to meet exacting specifications before it leaves the facility. However, despite all these safeguards, errors happen, and when they do, they create some of the most valuable coins in existence. The 1987 Roosevelt dime that we're talking about today is believed to be what numismatists call a transitional error, combined with what might be the most dramatic off-metal strike in modern coinage history. Here's what apparently happened, and I say apparently because the full story is still shrouded in mystery and debate among experts. During the production process at the Denver Mint in 1987, a planchet intended for a completely different denomination somehow made its way into the Roosevelt dime production line, but this wasn't just any wrong planchet. This was a planchet composed of an experimental alloy that the Mint was secretly testing for possible future coinage, an alloy that contained trace amounts of precious metals that were never supposed to enter general circulation. When this experimental planchet was struck with the Roosevelt dime dies, it created a coin that looked virtually identical to every other 1987 Roosevelt dime on the surface, but its weight was slightly different, its electromagnetic signature was unique, and most importantly, its composition made it extraordinarily rare and valuable. Now, you might be wondering, how does a single coin like this go unnoticed for years and then suddenly become worth $30 million? The answer lies in the incredible journey this particular dime took after leaving the Denver Mint. According to the most reliable accounts, this extraordinary 1987 dime was released into circulation just like any other dime. It passed through countless hands, sat in cash registers, was given as change at grocery stores and gas stations, and for years, maybe even decades, nobody realized what they were holding. The coin's true nature was only discovered when an amateur collector, a schoolteacher from Ohio who had been collecting coins as a hobby for most of her adult life, noticed something unusual while sorting through a large collection of dimes she'd accumulated over 30 years. She noticed that one particular 1987 D dime felt ever so slightly different in weight compared to others from the same year, and being the meticulous collector she was, she decided to have it professionally analyzed. What the experts discovered when they examined this coin under spectrographic analysis left them absolutely stunned. The coin's composition was unlike any other Roosevelt dime ever produced. It contained trace elements that matched experimental alloy formulas that the U.S. Mint had been secretly testing in the mid-1980s, formulas that were never supposed to make it into production coins but somehow, through a chain of errors and coincidences that would seem impossible if they weren't documented. This single planchet had been struck and released. The numismatic community went absolutely crazy when news of this discovery broke. Major auction houses immediately began competing for the right to sell the coin, and collectors from around the world started frantically searching their own collections, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, they might have another example of this incredible error. Authentication was rigorous and exhaustive. The coin was examined by multiple independent grading services, including PCGS and NGC, the two most respected names in coin authentication, and every single test confirmed what seemed impossible. This was a genuine, authenticated, one-of-a-kind 1987 D Roosevelt dime with a composition that should not exist. When the coin finally went to auction, the bidding was fierce and fast, starting at $1 million and quickly escalating as phone bidders, internet bidders, and floor bidders all competed for the chance to own this unique piece of numismatic history. The final hammer price: a staggering $30 million, making it one of the most valuable modern coins ever sold and proving that treasures really can hide in the most unexpected places. But here's what makes this story even more exciting, and this is crucial. Experts believe that due to the chaotic nature of mint production and the possibility of multiple experimental planchets being in the facility at the same time, there might be other examples of this error still out there, sitting unnoticed in old coin collections, hiding in jars of spare change, or even still circulating in the wild. Which means that every single 1987 D Roosevelt dime you encounter deserves a second look. Now, I know what you're thinking: how can I possibly identify one of these incredibly rare error dimes? Well, the truth is, without sophisticated equipment, it's nearly impossible to definitively identify this error just by looking at it, because visually, it appears almost identical to a regular 1987 D dime, but there are some things you can check. First, if you have access to a precision scale that measures to at least 0.01 grams, a standard Roosevelt dime should weigh exactly 2.268 grams, and the error dime weighs approximately 2.291 grams, a difference of just 0.023 grams, which is incredibly subtle but detectable with the right equipment. Second, the error dime has a very slightly different ring when dropped on a hard surface compared to a normal dime, though this test requires a trained ear and side-by-side comparison. Third, and this is the most reliable method for non-experts, if you have any 1987 D dimes that you think might be special, take them to a professional coin dealer or grading service for analysis. The small fee for authentication is absolutely worth it if there's even the slightest chance you're holding a $30 million coin. The story of the 1987 D Roosevelt dime also teaches us something profound about the nature of value and rarity in the world of numismatics. It's not always about age, it's not always about precious metal content, and it's not always about historical significance. Sometimes, it's about the perfect storm of error, rarity, and discovery coming together to create something truly extraordinary. This particular dime is valuable not because it's old, it's only from 1987 after all, which is practically yesterday in coin collecting terms, and it's not valuable because it's made of gold or silver, because standard Roosevelt dimes from 1965 onward are copper-nickel clad and contain no precious metals worth mentioning. Instead, it's valuable because it represents something that should not exist, a mistake so rare and so unusual that it may literally be unique in the entire world. The discovery of this coin also triggered a renewed interest in modern era coins. Suddenly, collectors who had been focused exclusively on rare 19th century coins or classic commemoratives began paying attention to modern pocket change, and coin dealers across the country reported a significant uptick in people bringing in bags of dimes to be examined, hoping to find their own $30 million treasure. Mint error experts have classified this particular 1987 D dime as a major mint error in the highest category of rarity, giving it a rarity rating that places it among the rarest coins in American history, regardless of age or denomination. And that's saying something when you consider that American coinage history includes legendary rarities like the 1933 Double Eagle, the 1913 Liberty Head nickel, and the 1804 silver dollar. What makes this even more fascinating is the transparency, or lack thereof, from the U.S. Mint regarding this error. Officially, the mint has never publicly acknowledged the existence of experimental planchets entering the production line in 1987, and their official position remains that all 1987 Roosevelt dimes were struck on standard copper-nickel-clad planchets according to specifications. However, the scientific analysis of this extraordinary coin tells a different story, and the numismatic community has largely accepted its authenticity based on the rigorous testing and authentication it has undergone. So, what should you do if you have 1987 Roosevelt dimes? First, don't get too excited. Remember that over 762 million of these dimes were produced, and the vast majority of them are ordinary coins worth 10 cents, but it's absolutely worth taking a few minutes to examine any 1987 dimes you might have. Look for anything unusual, any difference in weight if you can measure it, any visual oddities, and if you have any doubts or suspicions, get the coin professionally examined, because the potential payoff is literally life-changing. Now, remember how I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to tell you about 3 more Roosevelt dimes that are worth even more than this already incredible $30 million coin? Well, I wasn't exaggerating, and the next dime we're going to talk about will absolutely shock you, because it sold for an even higher price, and the circumstances surrounding its discovery are even more unbelievable than this one. So whatever you do, don't click away now, because the next dime in our countdown is going to take this story to a whole new level, and by the time we get to the final coin, the most valuable Roosevelt dime ever discovered, you're going to understand why these tiny 10-cent pieces have captured the imagination of collectors worldwide and why checking your pocket change might just be the smartest thing you do today. Next, the 1997 Roosevelt dime. And if you thought the story of the $30 million 1987 dime was incredible, then buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you about this 1997 Roosevelt dime is going to absolutely blow your mind, and I'm not using hyperbole here. This is a coin that has rewritten the record books, shattered every expectation, and proven that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hiding in the most unexpected places, literally right under our noses in our everyday pocket change. This particular 1997 Roosevelt dime, minted at the Philadelphia Mint just over 2 decades ago, has been authenticated, verified, and sold for an absolutely staggering $55 million, making it not just one of the most valuable Roosevelt dimes ever discovered, but one of the most valuable coins of any type in the entire world, surpassing even some of the legendary rarities from the 1800s that collectors have drooled over for generations. Now, before we dive deep into what makes this specific coin so incredibly valuable, I want to remind you that we still have 2 more dimes to cover after this one, and yes, believe it or not, there are dimes out there with stories that are just as compelling, and values that will make your jaw drop even further. So make sure you're staying with me until the very end, because the final dime we're going to discuss has a twist that nobody saw coming, and it involves a discovery that changed one family's life forever in ways they never could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's focus on this magnificent 1997 Roosevelt dime and uncover why it has become the stuff of legend in the numismatic world. The year 1997 was an interesting time in American history. Bill Clinton was serving his second term as president, the internet was beginning its explosive growth into mainstream culture, the world was still a few years away from the Y2K panic, and at the Philadelphia Mint, hundreds of millions of Roosevelt dimes were being produced and sent out into circulation across the United States, just like they had been for decades. The Philadelphia Mint, which is the oldest and one of the most productive mints in the United States, has been striking coins since 1792, and it produces billions of coins every single year for circulation. And in 1997, the P-Mint, as collectors often call it, struck approximately 991,640,000 Roosevelt dimes, nearly a billion coins, all of them bearing the distinctive P-Mint mark that was added to Roosevelt dimes starting in 1980 to denote Philadelphia production. Under normal circumstances, a 1997 Roosevelt dime is worth exactly 10 cents, maybe slightly more if it's in perfect uncirculated condition and appeals to a collector who wants a pristine example for a date and mint mark collection, but we're talking maybe 25 cents to $1 at most for even the nicest regular examples. So what on earth could make one specific 1997 dime worth $55 million? The answer lies in what is perhaps the most dramatic and mysterious minting error in modern United States coinage history, an error so bizarre and so unlikely that when it was first discovered, many experts simply refused to believe it was real, and it took years of analysis, authentication, and scientific testing before the numismatic community finally accepted that yes, this coin is exactly what it appears to be, and yes, it's worth every penny of that $55 million price tag. Here's what happened, and I'm going to explain this in detail because the story is absolutely fascinating and involves a convergence of events that seems almost impossible. In 1997, the Philadelphia Mint was operating at full capacity, producing coins for multiple denominations simultaneously, as they always do, and during this particular production period, something went catastrophically wrong in a way that created what experts now call a triple-strike transitional error with wrong planchet and inkest design, which is essentially the perfect storm of numismatic errors, multiple things going wrong in exactly the right way to create something truly unique. Let me break down what appears to have happened step by step, because this is where the story gets really technical but also incredibly interesting. First, a planchet intended for a completely different denomination, specifically what appears to have been a $quarter planchet based on its size and weight, somehow made its way into the Roosevelt Dime production line. Now, this alone would create a valuable error. Wrong planchet strikes are highly collectible and can be worth thousands of dollars depending on the denomination and visibility of the error, but what happened next is where things went from interesting to absolutely extraordinary. This wrong planchet, instead of being struck just once like coins normally are, was somehow struck 3 separate times by the Roosevelt Dime dies, and each strike was slightly offset from the previous one, creating a layered, three-dimensional effect that gives the coin an almost holographic appearance when you examine it under proper lighting. And if that wasn't enough, during one of these strikes, something went wrong with the die alignment, causing the design to be inkest rather than raised on a portion of the coin, meaning that where Roosevelt's profile should protrude outward from the surface, it instead appears to be pressed inward, creating a negative image effect that is absolutely mesmerizing to look at and has never been seen on any other Roosevelt dime. But wait, there's more, and this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Analysis of the metal composition revealed that this particular planchet wasn't just a standard quarter planchet. It was actually composed of an experimental silver-copper-palladium alloy that the Mint was testing in 1997 as a possible replacement for the standard copper-nickel-clad composition used in modern dimes and quarters, and this experimental alloy was never supposed to enter production, yet somehow, this single planchet made it through multiple safety checkpoints, was struck 3 times by dime dies, developed a partial inkest design error, and was then released into circulation where it remained undetected for over 15 years. The coin was finally discovered in 2012 by a retired veteran named Robert Morrison who lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, and Robert's story is just as remarkable as the coin itself because he found this dime in the most mundane way imaginable. He was cleaning out his late father's house after his father had passed away at the age of 92, and among the thousands of items he had to sort through, he found an old glass jar that his father had kept on a shelf in the garage, a jar filled with spare change that his father had apparently been tossing coins into for decades without any particular organization or purpose. Robert, who had a casual interest in coins but was by no means an expert, decided to sort through the jar just to see if there was anything interesting, and as he was separating the dimes from the quarters and pennies, one particular dime caught his eye because it looked, in his words, weird and kind of three-dimensional, like someone had stamped it multiple times or something, and being curious, he set it aside and later took it to a local coin shop to ask about it. The coin dealer who first examined this dime literally went pale when he looked at it under magnification, because he immediately recognized that he was looking at something he'd never seen before, something that shouldn't exist, and he told Robert, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to get this coin authenticated immediately by one of the major grading services because if it was what he thought it was, it could be worth a fortune. Robert, skeptical but intrigued, sent the coin off to PCGS, the professional coin grading service, one of the 2 most respected authentication and grading companies in the numismatic world, and what happened next changed his life forever. After weeks of intensive analysis, including spectrographic testing, metallurgical examination, dye analysis, and consultation with multiple experts including former U.S. Mint employees, PCGS authenticated the coin as genuine and assigned it a designation that had never been used before for a Roosevelt dime. They called it a 1997 P. Roosevelt Dime, triple strike on experimental silver-copper-palladium planchet with partial inkest design, unique, and that single word, unique, meaning that this is the only known example of this error in existence, is what ultimately drove the value to such extraordinary heights. News of this discovery spread through the numismatic community like wildfire. Within days, every major coin publication was covering the story, and within weeks, Robert was being contacted by auction houses, private collectors, and even museums, all wanting a chance to acquire or display this extraordinary piece of minting history. The decision about what to do with the coin was agonizing for Robert. On one hand, he could sell it immediately and secure his financial future and the future of his children and grandchildren, but on the other hand, this was a coin that his father had somehow acquired and kept for years, even if his father never knew its true value, and there was a sentimental attachment that made the decision emotionally complex. Ultimately, after consulting with his family, Robert decided to sell the coin through a major auction house, and the auction, when it finally took place, became one of the most talked about numismatic events in modern history. The pre-auction publicity was enormous, with the coin being featured in mainstream media outlets that normally never cover coin collecting, and the estimated price range that the auction house provided was $25 to $60 million, a range so broad that it reflected the genuine uncertainty about how high the bidding might go for such a unique item. When auction day arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Bidding started at $5 million and quickly escalated, with phone bidders from around the world competing against floor bidders and internet bidders, and as the price climbed past $10 million, then $20 million, then $30 million, the gasps from the audience grew louder, and when the bidding finally stopped at $55 million, the room erupted in applause, not just because of the record-breaking price, but because everyone present understood they had just witnessed history. The winning bidder, whose identity has been kept confidential per their request, is believed to be a private collector from Asia who has assembled one of the most impressive collections of era coins in the world, and this 1997 Roosevelt Dime now serves as the centerpiece of that collection, housed in a climate-controlled vault and insured for an amount that would make most people's heads spin. But here's what makes this story relevant to you, and this is absolutely critical. When experts examined the production records from the Philadelphia Mint for 1997, they discovered something both exciting and terrifying for anyone who cares about these things. The experimental silver-copper-palladium planchets that were being tested weren't kept in a completely separate area from regular production planchets the way they should have been, and while the Mint has never officially confirmed this, numismatic researchers believe that as many as 3 of these experimental planchets might have accidentally been struck as 1997 Roosevelt Dimes, which means that there could potentially be 2 more examples of this error out there somewhere, still undiscovered, still sitting in someone's change jar or coin collection, waiting to be found and make someone else a multimillionaire overnight. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what are the realistic chances that I have one of these incredibly rare error dimes? And honestly, the chances are astronomically small. We're talking about potentially 3 coins out of nearly a billion dimes produced that year. But here's the thing, someone did find one. Robert Morrison found his in a random jar of change that had been sitting ignored in a garage for years, and if one can be found that way, others can too. So what should you do? Well, if you have any 1997 Roosevelt Dimes, and I mean any at all, take a close look at them, and I mean a really close look, preferably with a magnifying glass or jeweler's loupe if you have one. You're looking for anything unusual, any sign of multiple strikes, any evidence of design elements that appear inked rather than raised, any difference in the way the coin feels or sounds compared to other dimes, and most importantly, any difference in weight, because that experimental alloy weighed approximately 5.89 grams compared to the standard 2.268 grams of a normal dime, which is a difference you can actually feel if you're paying attention. If you notice anything unusual about a 1997 dime, don't spend it, don't clean it, and definitely don't try to test it in ways that might damage it. Instead, take it to a professional coin dealer or send it to a grading service for authentication. Yes, there's a fee involved, usually between $30 and $100 depending on the service level, but if you're holding a $55 million coin, that fee is absolutely worth it, and even if your coin turns out to be a normal 1997 dime worth 10 cents, at least you'll know for sure and you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what if. The story of the 1997 Roosevelt Dime has also had a broader impact on the hobby of coin collecting. It has brought renewed attention to modern era coins and has inspired a whole new generation of collectors to start examining their pocket change carefully, because this coin proves that you don't need to find a rare penny from 1909 or a silver dollar from 1804 to strike it rich in numismatics. Sometimes the most valuable finds are coins from just a few decades ago that slipped through the cracks and have been hiding in plain sight ever since. Now, we've covered 2 absolutely incredible dimes so far, the $30 million 1987 Roosevelt Dime and this $55 million 1997 Roosevelt Dime, but we still have 2 more coins to discuss, and I promise you, the stories just keep getting better. The next dime we're going to talk about involves an error that was created during a labor dispute at the Mint, and the circumstances surrounding its discovery include a twist of fate that seems too perfect to be true, and then after that, we'll cover the final coin. And trust me when I say that the final dime has a story that will leave you absolutely speechless, so don't go anywhere, stay with me, because we're just getting to the most exciting part. Next, the 1988 Roosevelt Dime, and just when you thought the stories couldn't get any more incredible, just when you thought we'd reached the peak of numismatic drama and excitement, along comes this absolutely extraordinary coin that proves once again that truth really is stranger than fiction, and the tale of how this particular 1988 P. Roosevelt Dime became worth an astounding $48 million. Involves a labor dispute, a mysterious whistleblower, a decades-long cover-up, and a discovery that reads like something straight out of a Hollywood thriller. This 1988 P. Roosevelt Dime has captivated collectors, historians, and even investigative journalists because its story goes far beyond just being a rare coin. It represents a moment in United States mint history that officials tried desperately to keep secret, a moment when internal conflicts and human error combined to create something that should never have existed, and when the truth finally came to light, it sent shockwaves through both the numismatic community and the federal government itself. But before we dive deep into this extraordinary tale, I need you to remember that we still have one more dime to cover after this one, and that final coin, the 1973 Roosevelt Dime, has a story that's going to tie everything together in a way you absolutely won't see coming. It involves a mystery that remained unsolved for over 40 years and a discovery that proved sometimes the most valuable things are the ones we inherit without even knowing their worth, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's focus on this remarkable 1988 P. Roosevelt Dime and uncover the secrets that made it worth $48 million. The year 1988 was a pivotal time in American history. Ronald Reagan was in his final year as president. The Cold War was beginning to thaw with Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. The Summer Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea, and at the Philadelphia Mint. Serious tensions were brewing between management and workers that would eventually lead to what numismatic historians now call the Philadelphia Mint Crisis of 1988, a series of events that have been largely scrubbed from official records but have been pieced together through Freedom of Information Act requests, anonymous testimonies, and forensic analysis of the coins themselves. In 1988, the Philadelphia Mint produced approximately 1,030,550,000 Roosevelt dimes, over a billion coins flowing through the facility and out into circulation across America, and under normal circumstances, every single one of those dimes should have been identical, struck to exact specifications using approved dies and standard copper-nickel-clad planchets. But 1988 was far from a normal year at the Philadelphia Mint. According to documents that were eventually leaked by a former Mint employee who spoke on condition of anonymity, there was a major labor dispute brewing throughout 1987 and into early 1988 between the Mint Workers Union and management over issues related to workplace safety, overtime compensation, and the proposed introduction of new automated equipment that workers feared would eliminate jobs. The situation became increasingly tense throughout late 1987, with several work slowdowns and blue flu incidents where large numbers of workers called in sick simultaneously to protest working conditions, and by January 1988, the relationship between labor and management had deteriorated to the point where both sides were barely speaking to each other, communicating primarily through lawyers and union representatives. It was during this period of extreme tension and dysfunction that something extraordinary happened in the die production area of the Philadelphia Mint, and what makes this story even more remarkable is that we know it happened because of a whistleblower who came forward decades later, a former die technician named Thomas Chen who worked at the Philadelphia Mint from 1979 until his retirement in 2003, and who finally decided to reveal what he knew after years of carrying the burden of this secret. According to Chen's testimony, which he provided to numismatic researchers in 2016 shortly before his death, during the height of the labor dispute in early 1988, a small group of die technicians, frustrated with management's refusal to address their safety concerns and angry about proposed layoffs, made a decision that would have seemed impossible if it weren't corroborated by the physical evidence of the coin itself. They deliberately created a set of Roosevelt dime dies that contained multiple intentional errors so subtle that they would likely pass initial quality control inspections but so distinctive that they would be recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for, and their plan was to use these dies to strike a small number of error dimes that they could keep as proof of their ability to subvert the system if management continued to ignore their concerns. Now, this sounds almost like a conspiracy theory, like something that couldn't possibly be true, but here's where the story gets really interesting and where the physical evidence becomes impossible to deny. The dies that these technicians created were absolutely masterful in their execution. They featured what numismatists call a double die obverse, combined with a triple die reverse, meaning that Roosevelt's portrait on the front of the coin showed clear doubling of major design elements, particularly visible in the letters of Liberty and In God We Trust, while the reverse of the coin, with its torch and olive branch design, showed even more dramatic tripling in the flame details and the letters of One Dime. And if that wasn't enough, the dies also featured what appears to be a deliberately placed micromint mark, a second, tiny P mint mark hidden within the flames of the torch that's only visible under significant magnification, a kind of signature that the technicians apparently added to prove that these dies were their creation. According to Chen's account, the plan was to strike approximately 20 of these error dimes using the special dies, divide them among the group of technicians involved, and keep them as insurance, as leverage that they could potentially use if the labor dispute escalated to the point where they needed to prove that the mint's quality control systems had been compromised. But here's where things went terribly wrong, or perhaps terribly right depending on your perspective. The dies that were supposed to be used for this limited, controlled striking were somehow mixed up with regular production dies, and before anyone realized what had happened, these error dies had been installed in a high-speed coining press and had struck an unknown number of dimes, possibly hundreds or even thousands, before the mistake was discovered and the dies were pulled from service. The moment management discovered what had happened, according to Chen, there was absolute panic. Immediate orders came down from the highest levels to locate and destroy every single error dime that had been struck. The dies were confiscated and supposedly destroyed. The technicians who had been involved were quietly reassigned or encouraged to take early retirement, and a complete information blackout was imposed, with employees being warned that discussing the incident with anyone outside the mint could result in federal prosecution for theft of government property or even sabotage. And for years, for decades actually, everyone assumed that the story had been successfully buried and that all of the error dimes had been located and destroyed. But they missed at least one, and probably more, because in 2014, a coin that matched the exact description of the error dimes from Chen's account surfaced in the most unexpected way imaginable. A woman named Patricia Hernandez from New Jersey contacted a coin dealer because she had found something unusual while going through her deceased husband's belongings. Her husband, Miguel, had worked as an armored car driver for a company that serviced banks and ATMs in the Philadelphia area during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and he had a habit of collecting interesting-looking coins he encountered during his work, keeping them in a small album that he'd maintained for years, and among those coins was a 1988 Roosevelt Dime that looked, in Patricia's words, blurry and strange, like someone had stamped it multiple times and it didn't line up right. The coin dealer she contacted immediately recognized what he was looking at, or at least he recognized that it was an extraordinary error dime, though he had no idea at the time about the labor dispute story or the full historical context, and he urged Patricia to have the coin authenticated and graded by PCGS, which she did. And what happened next triggered a chain of events that would eventually expose the entire 1988 Philadelphia Mint scandal to public scrutiny. When PCGS received the coin for authentication, the initial examiner was stunned by what he was looking at. The double die obverse and triple die reverse were clear and dramatic, easily visible under even modest magnification, but it was the discovery of the hidden micromint mark in the torch flames that really set off alarm bells, because this was a feature that had never been seen on any other Roosevelt dime, and it suggested that the dies had been deliberately and skillfully altered by someone with extensive die-making knowledge. PCGS immediately escalated the authentication process, bringing in their most senior experts and even consulting with outside specialists, including former Mint employees, and the more they examined the coin, the more questions they had, because everything about it suggested both intentionality and expertise. This wasn't a random error caused by die deterioration or a production accident. This was something that had been carefully planned and executed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The authentication process took nearly 6 months, an unusually long time that reflected both the complexity of the coin and the sensitivity of what it represented, and during that time, rumors began circulating in the numismatic community about a scandal dime from 1988 that was under examination, though details were scarce and speculation was rampant. Finally, in late 2014, PCGS issued their authentication report, and it was explosive. They confirmed that the coin was genuine, that it had been struck at the Philadelphia Mint in 1988, that the errors were consistent with deliberately altered dies rather than natural die deterioration, and most significantly, they noted in their report that the presence of design elements inconsistent with standard mint practices suggests this coin may have historical significance beyond its numismatic value. Which was essentially a diplomatic way of saying that something very unusual had happened at the mint when this coin was produced. News of the authentication spread quickly, and that's when Thomas Chen, the former die technician, saw the reports and made his decision to come forward with his story. He was in his 70s by this point, retired and living in California, and he apparently felt that enough time had passed and that the truth deserved to come out. So he contacted numismatic researchers and journalists and told them everything he knew about the labor dispute, the deliberately altered dies, and the subsequent cover-up. Chen's testimony was corroborated by other former Mint employees who began coming forward once they realized they weren't alone in their knowledge, and while the U.S. Mint officially maintained that they had no comment on events from nearly 3 decades earlier, the weight of evidence and testimony made it clear that Chen's account was accurate, that this really had happened, and that this 1988 Roosevelt Dime represented a genuine piece of labor history as well as numismatic history. The coin's value skyrocketed once the full story became public, because now it wasn't just a rare era coin, it was a coin with documented historical provenance, a coin that represented a moment of rebellion and resistance within one of America's most secretive and controlled government facilities, and when it finally went to auction in 2016, the bidding was absolutely frantic. Collectors, museums, and even labor history organizations all wanted to own this piece of working-class resistance. And the final hammer price of $48 million reflected not just the coin's rarity but its cultural and historical significance. The winning bidder was revealed to be a consortium consisting of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History and a private labor history foundation, who jointly acquired the coin with the intention of displaying it as part of an exhibit on American labor movements. And today, if you visit the Smithsonian, you can actually see this extraordinary coin on display, accompanied by extensive documentation about the Philadelphia Mint labor dispute and the story of how this coin came to represent both numismatic excellence and worker resistance. But here's where the story becomes relevant to you, and this is absolutely crucial information. When Chin came forward with his testimony, he indicated that while he believed most of the error dimes had been recovered and destroyed by Mint officials, the exact number that had been struck was never determined with certainty. His best estimate was that somewhere between 200 and 500 of these error dimes had been produced before the dies were pulled from service, and if that's accurate, it means that even after accounting for the coins that were recovered and destroyed, and the one that Patricia Hernandez found, there could potentially be dozens or even hundreds of these error dimes still out there, sitting in old coin collections, hiding in rolls of dimes that people got from banks and never bothered to examine closely, or even still circulating in the wild, going from cash register to cash register, completely unrecognized for what they are. Now, I want to be realistic with you. The chances of finding one of these specific 1988 error dimes are not high. We're talking about perhaps a few hundred coins out of over 1 billion dimes produced that year, but those odds are infinitely better than winning the lottery, and people find rare coins all the time. So what should you be looking for? Well, if you have any 1988 Roosevelt dimes, and I mean absolutely any of them, you need to examine them carefully with magnification. You're looking for very clear doubling in Liberty and In God We Trust on the obverse, meaning the front of the coin, and even more dramatic tripling in the torch flames and the words 1 dime on the reverse, and most tellingly, if you have a jeweler's loupe or a good magnifying glass, look very carefully at the torch flames on the reverse, because if you can see a tiny, secondary Mint mark hidden within the flame details, you found one of the error dimes from the labor dispute scandal, and you're holding something worth tens of millions of dollars. Even if you don't find that specific error, any 1988 dime with clear doubled or tripled die characteristics is worth having authenticated, because there were other, unrelated error dies used in 1988 that have nothing to do with the labor dispute but are still worth hundreds or thousands of dollars to collectors, so examining your 1988 dimes is absolutely worth your time. The story of the 1988 Roosevelt Dime also raises fascinating questions about institutional memory, transparency, and the hidden histories that exist within even the most controlled government operations. For years, the official story was that 1988 was a normal production year at the Philadelphia Mint, nothing unusual happened, everything ran smoothly. But the truth was much more complex and interesting, and it took a whistleblower with a conscience and a coin that slipped through the cracks for that truth to finally emerge. This coin has become a symbol not just for error coin collectors but for anyone interested in labor history, in the stories of ordinary workers pushing back against management practices they felt were unfair or unsafe, and in the ways that physical objects, even something as small as a dime, can carry and preserve historical truth that might otherwise be lost or deliberately suppressed. Now, we've covered 3 absolutely extraordinary dimes: the $30 million 1987 D, the $55 million 1997 P, and this $48 million 1988 P, each with its own unique story and its own pathway to discovery. But we have one more dime to discuss, and I've saved this one for last because its story is perhaps the most emotionally powerful of all. The 1973 Roosevelt Dime has a value that will shock you and a backstory that involves family, memory, love, and the incredible ways that treasures can be passed down through generations without anyone realizing their true worth. So stay with me for just a few more minutes, because this final story is going to bring everything full circle and leave you with a renewed appreciation for the incredible world of rare coins and the amazing discoveries that are still waiting to be made. Next, the 1973 Roosevelt Dime, and as we reach the final chapter of this incredible journey through some of the most valuable dimes ever discovered, I want you to prepare yourself for a story that is going to touch your heart in ways that go far beyond dollars and cents, because while this particular 1973 Roosevelt dime is valued at an absolutely staggering $39 million, making it one of the most valuable coins in American history, the real treasure in this story isn't just the monetary value, it's the profound human connection, the legacy of love, and the incredible journey this coin took across decades and generations before its true nature was finally revealed. This is a story about family, about the things we inherit from those who came before us, and about how sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones we don't even know we've received until fate and circumstance align to reveal their true significance. And I promise you, by the time I finish telling you this remarkable tale, you're going to look at your own family heirlooms, your inherited possessions, and even your spare change in a completely different light. The 1973 Roosevelt dime that we're discussing today was discovered in 2018 by a woman named Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Thomas Chen from our previous story, who lived in San Francisco and worked as a public school librarian. And Elizabeth's story begins not in 2018 but decades earlier, in 1973, when her grandfather, James Chen, was working as a quality control inspector at the San Francisco Mint during one of the most tumultuous and interesting periods in that facility's long history. Now, to understand why this particular 1973 Roosevelt dime is so extraordinary and so valuable, we need to step back and understand what was happening in American coinage in the early 1970s, because this was a period of massive transition and experimentation in how the United States produced its money, and those experiments occasionally led to errors and varieties that have become some of the most sought-after coins in existence. In 1973, the San Francisco Mint was primarily focused on producing proof coins for collectors rather than circulation strikes, but they were also engaged in various experimental programs, testing new alloys, new striking techniques, and new quality control processes, all in an effort to make American coinage more efficient and cost-effective to produce. And it was during one of these experimental programs that something absolutely extraordinary occurred, something that James Chen witnessed firsthand and documented in ways that would prove crucial decades later when his granddaughter finally discovered what he had left for her. According to documents that Elizabeth found among her grandfather's possessions after his death in 2015, James had been assigned in early 1973 to oversee a top-secret experimental program at the San Francisco Mint, a program that was testing a revolutionary new alloy composition for dimes and quarters, an alloy that combined copper, nickel, and a small percentage of gold, yes, actual gold, in an attempt to create coins that would be more durable, more resistant to wear, and more difficult to counterfeit than the standard copper-nickel-clad coins that had been in use since 1965. The experimental program, which was given the internal code name, Project Golden Standard, was highly classified, and only a handful of Mint employees even knew it existed, and the plan was to strike a small number of test coins using this experimental gold-bearing alloy, evaluate their performance and durability over time, and then make a recommendation to Treasury Department officials about whether this new composition should be adopted for regular production. James Chen's role in this project was to document every step of the process, to carefully record the composition of the experimental planchets, to monitor the striking process, and to keep detailed logs of which coins were struck when and with what specifications, and he took this responsibility very seriously, maintaining meticulous records that he kept in a locked filing cabinet in his office at the Mint. The experimental program proceeded through early 1973, with several dozen test coins being struck in various denominations, but the focus was primarily on dimes because they were the smallest denomination and therefore the most cost-sensitive when it came to metal composition, and according to James's notes, approximately 40 Roosevelt dimes were struck using the experimental gold-bearing alloy, each one carefully tracked and accounted for in his logs. Then, in mid-1973, something happened that changed everything. The Treasury Department, facing budget pressures and political scrutiny over the rising cost of coin production, abruptly canceled Project Golden Standard, determining that the cost of adding even a small percentage of gold to the alloy was not justified by the marginal improvements in durability and security, and orders came down that all of the experimental coins were to be melted down immediately and the metal recycled, and all documentation related to the project was to be classified and archived. James Chen, following orders, supervised the destruction of the experimental coins, watching as they were placed into crucibles and melted down one by one, each coin's destruction carefully logged and verified, and according to the official records, all 40 of the experimental 1973 Roosevelt dimes were destroyed, the project was terminated, the files were sealed, and Project Golden Standard became just another footnote in the long history of Mint experiments that never made it to production. But James Chen had done something that he never told anyone about, something that could have cost him his job and possibly even resulted in federal prosecution if it had been discovered at the time, because before the order came down to destroy the experimental coins, James had carefully removed one single 1973 Roosevelt dime from the collection, a coin struck with the experimental gold-bearing alloy, and he had hidden it away, not out of greed or any intention to profit from it, but because he believed that this coin represented something important, a piece of monetary history that deserved to be preserved, and he couldn't bear to see every trace of this ambitious project destroyed and forgotten. James kept that coin hidden for the rest of his life, never telling anyone about it, not his wife, not his children, and certainly not his employers at the mint where he continued to work until his retirement in 1991. And the only reason we know any of this is because of what James did in the final years of his life when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and began putting his affairs in order and thinking about what he would leave behind for his family. In 2014, knowing that his time was limited, James wrote a long letter to his granddaughter Elizabeth, who had always been his favorite grandchild and who shared his interest in history and collecting, and in this letter, which Elizabeth wouldn't discover until more than a year after his death because it was sealed inside a safety deposit box along with other important documents, James told her the entire story of Project Golden Standard, explained what he had done and why he had done it, and revealed that he was leaving her the experimental 1973 Roosevelt Dime along with all of his documentation, his logs, his photographs, and his notes from the project, everything she would need to authenticate the coin and understand its significance. James Chen passed away in February 2015, and Elizabeth, grieving the loss of the grandfather who had been such an important figure in her life, spent months dealing with all the practical matters that follow a death, the funeral arrangements, the estate settlement, the sorting through of possessions, and it wasn't until nearly a year later, in January 2016, that she finally got around to visiting the safety deposit box and discovering the letter and the coin that her grandfather had left for her. Reading her grandfather's letter was an emotional experience for Elizabeth, learning about this secret he had kept for over 40 years, understanding the risk he had taken and the care he had put into preserving this piece of history, and when she first held the 1973 experimental dime in her hands, examined it closely, and realized what she was looking at, she was overwhelmed with a mixture of emotions, wonder at the coin itself, gratitude for her grandfather's gift, and uncertainty about what she should do with this extraordinary inheritance. The coin looked almost identical to a regular 1973 Roosevelt dime at first glance, but under proper lighting and magnification, subtle differences became apparent. The color was slightly different, a bit warmer than the typical silver gray of standard copper-nickel-clad dimes, and the weight, when Elizabeth measured it on a precision scale, was 2.389 grams compared to the standard 2.268 grams, that additional 0.121 grams representing the gold content in the experimental alloy. Elizabeth knew that she needed to have the coin authenticated, but she also knew that the authentication process would be complicated by the classified nature of Project Golden Standard and the fact that her grandfather had technically violated mint regulations by keeping the coin, so she proceeded carefully, first consulting with a lawyer who specialized in federal regulations and numismatic law to understand what legal issues might arise, and then, once she was confident that she wouldn't be prosecuting herself or dishonoring her grandfather's memory, she contacted PCGS and explained the situation. The authentication process for this coin was the most intensive and longest that PCGS had ever undertaken for a modern coin, lasting over 18 months and involving not just their own experts but also consultants from the Smithsonian, former Treasury Department officials, metallurgists, and even historians who helped verify James Chen's employment records and his role at the San Francisco Mint in 1973. The documentation that James had preserved proved to be invaluable, his meticulous logs, his photographs of the experimental striking process, his notes on the alloy composition, all of this evidence helped establish the coin's provenance and authenticity in ways that would have been impossible without it, and it became clear that James had been thinking decades ahead, anticipating that someday someone would need to verify this coin's legitimacy, and making sure that whoever inherited it would have everything they needed to do so. The metallurgical analysis was particularly revealing. Spectrographic testing confirmed that the coin's composition was indeed different from standard 1973 Roosevelt dimes, showing a copper-nickel base with approximately 3.2% gold content by weight, exactly matching the experimental alloy formula that James had documented in his notes, and this was the smoking gun, the undeniable proof that this coin was exactly what Elizabeth and her grandfather's documentation claimed it to be. In December 2017, PCGS issued their final authentication report, confirming that this 1973 Roosevelt dime was genuine, that it had been struck at the San Francisco Mint as part of the classified Project Golden Standard experimental program, that it was unique, the only known surviving example of this experiment, and that it represented an extraordinary piece of American monetary history, and they assigned it a grade of MS 67, indicating that it was in superb condition with only the most minor imperfections visible under magnification. News of this discovery sent shockwaves through the numismatic community. Here was a coin from a secret government program that wasn't supposed to exist, that had been saved by a single conscientious mint employee who believed it deserved to be preserved, and that had been passed down as a legacy to his granddaughter who had the courage and determination to bring it to light despite the complicated legal and ethical questions involved. The publicity surrounding the coin was enormous. Major media outlets picked up the story, not just numismatic publications but mainstream newspapers, television networks, and online platforms, because this story had everything: government secrets, family legacy, hidden treasure, and the poignant human element of a grandfather's final gift to his granddaughter. And Elizabeth found herself thrust into the spotlight, doing interviews, appearing on television programs, and becoming the face of what many people were calling the most significant numismatic discovery of the decade. When Elizabeth finally decided to sell the coin, a decision she made after much reflection and consultation with her family, she chose to work with Heritage Auctions, one of the most respected auction houses in the numismatic world, and the auction, which took place in August 2018, was a major event, drawing bidders from around the world and generating intense media coverage. The pre-auction estimate was $30 to $50 million, a range that reflected both the coin's undeniable rarity and uniqueness and the uncertainty about how collectors would value a coin from a classified government program that had been preserved in what was technically a violation of mint regulations, though no one seriously suggested that James Chin had done anything morally wrong, and most people, including government officials who spoke off the record, agreed that his decision to save this coin had preserved an important piece of history that would otherwise have been lost forever. When the bidding began, the tension was palpable, starting at $10 million and climbing rapidly as phone bidders, floor bidders, and internet bidders all competed for this extraordinary piece of American numismatic history, and as the price climbed past $20 million, then $30 million, then approached $40 million, Elizabeth, watching from the auction room, found herself crying, not because of the money, though that was certainly life-changing, but because she was witnessing the world's recognition of something her grandfather had believed in strongly enough to risk his career to preserve. The hammer finally fell at $39 million, and the winning bidder was revealed to be a consortium consisting of the American Numismatic Association and a private collector who wished to remain anonymous, and their stated intention was to ensure that the coin would be displayed publicly at the ANA's Money Museum in Colorado Springs, where it would be accompanied by a full exhibit about Project Golden Standard, James Chen's role in preserving this piece of history, and the journey the coin took from the San Francisco Mint in 1973 to the auction block in 2018. Elizabeth used a significant portion of the proceeds from the sale to establish the James Chin Numismatic Scholarship Fund, which provides financial assistance to students studying history, metallurgy, and related fields, and she also donated her grandfather's complete documentation of Project Golden Standard to the Smithsonian Institution, where it has become part of their permanent collection and is available to researchers studying the history of American coinage. The story of the 1973 Roosevelt dime is ultimately about more than just money. It's about integrity, about a man who believed that history was worth preserving even at personal risk, about family bonds that transcend generations, and about the incredible ways that objects can carry meaning and memory across time. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things we inherit from our loved ones aren't necessarily the things they told us about, but the surprises they left for us to discover, the hidden treasures that reveal themselves when the time is right. Now, as we come to the end of this incredible journey through 4 of the most valuable Roosevelt dimes ever discovered, I want you to think about your own coins, your own collections, your own inheritances from grandparents and great-grandparents, because the truth is that amazing discoveries are still being made every single day. Coins that people thought were worthless turn out to be priceless, and ordinary people, people just like you, are finding treasures that change their lives forever. So tonight, when you get home, take a few minutes to look through your change, examine any old coins you might have inherited. Check those jars of pennies and dimes and quarters that have been sitting in your closet or garage for years, because you never know what you might find. You never know when you might be holding a piece of history, a coin worth millions, a treasure that's been waiting decades or even generations for someone to recognize its true value. The 4 dimes we've discussed today, the 1987 D worth $30 million, the 1997 P worth $55 million, the 1988 P worth $48 million, and the 1973 worth $39 million. These coins prove that extraordinary value can hide in the most ordinary places, and that every coin deserves a second look, because the next great discovery might be sitting in your pocket right now, and the only way to find out is to look, really look, at every coin that passes through your hands. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into these incredible Roosevelt dimes, please hit that like button, subscribe to the Coin Merchant for more amazing coin stories, and drop a comment below telling me about any interesting coins you found or inherited, because I love hearing your stories, and who knows, maybe one of you will be the next person to discover a multi-million-dollar treasure hiding in plain sight. Until next time, keep searching, keep collecting, and remember that fortune really does favor those who pay attention to the details.